Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is October 24th, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about lineage and lore, and a little about just sort of the history of herbal medicine in general, and about this tradition in particular. Um, and so it's going to be a little more, it's a little different than what we usually do, but hopefully, hopefully you'll enjoy this and find it interesting. But I just feel like it's good to have a sense of what the legacy is and what the tradition is that I'm coming from, and that this information is coming from in general. So part of the reason that I like to do this at this time of year is because this is, well, Halloween and All Souls Day are traditionally holidays that are about the ancestors and the people that have gone before us. And so, sort of in keeping with that, I like to have a class around this time of year that's about that, and about the history of the people who came before us in this profession, and in this lineage in particular. And so hopefully you'll find that interesting. And next week, uh, Tuesday is the 31st, so I'm going to do class on Wednesday instead of Tuesday next week. And then after that, we'll just go back to the regular time. But I'll do Wednesday at 7:30 instead of Tuesday at 7:30 next week. So be aware of that. I'm going to write something to that effect in the chat log. Right. So, as you know, herbal medicine has a history that goes back as far as the history of humanity, possibly a little further than that. People have been using herbal medicine for as long as there have been people, and in many cases, people probably learned about uh, herbs from watching animals and seeing how the animals, which herbs the animals ate and didn't eat, and also by learning to associate certain tastes with certain medicinal properties. There's pretty good consistency across various different types of plants of tastes, like a piney taste or a camphor type taste, or a spicy taste, or a very bitter taste, having some fairly consistent medicinal properties in terms of how they affect fluids in the body and things like that. So people learned a lot about uh, herbs early on, we think, from either directly experiencing the herbs themselves or from watching animals using the herb, watching animals selectively consume and avoid different herbs and different fruits and things like that. So we know from both the fact, well, we know that people have used herbs for a very long time, partly because when we find uh, bones of Stone Age people and tools from where they lived and things like that, we will also find seeds and other fragments of herbs uh, among the same layers of dirt, things that they were consuming and using, and that sort of thing. And from the earliest time that people started writing things down, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, we start having descriptions of herbs and how people used herbs and people's relationships with plants. In fact, one of the oldest stories that is written down by people is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Sumerian epic uh, poem in which a major plot point in it is someone going on a quest to find an herb that will bestow immortal life. Um, so, from the very earliest records, uh, herbal medicine has been a part of human life. And in a few places in the world, there are started being writing thousands of years ago, and people started recording stuff about herbal medicine. And this is especially true in China and in the Middle East. And shortly after the Middle East, well, not really that shortly, but after the Middle East, the Mediterranean region. So China and ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia started writing things down thousands and thousands of years ago. Maybe 3,000 years ago, people in Southern Europe, Northern Mediterranean started writing things down as well, with writing that they had learned from the Phoenicians, who learned it from the Egyptians. So, that area, that's all a very small area of the world, really. And then China is kind of developed separately further away. But in those places, we have written traditions of medicine going back very far. Also in India, you get existing writings from about 3,000 years ago on up to the present, often including some of the same medicinal herbs that are used now. In a lot of places in the world, people weren't using writing, and they were still using herbal medicine. But in this part of the world, in what would later come to be called the Americas, and also in most of Northern Europe and in much of Africa and in really large parts of Asia as well, you didn't really have much tradition of people writing things down. In some cases, they did have writing systems and could write, or there were a few people in the culture who could write, but it was not a widely practiced thing. It was maybe only used for certain types of record keeping. It was just not something that was very widespread. And even in the places where it was, even in the places I mentioned before, it would be, literacy would be a small part of the population, not a general thing like it is in our time of the world. So a lot of the time throughout the history, when people knew about the healing powers of a particular plant, they might pass that information on to an apprentice, and it might be, in some cases, a fairly closely guarded type of thing. Of course, there were definitely remedies that were known to the general public as well, but some of the more specialized techniques might have been kept in certain families or in certain medicine societies, certain groups of people who had access to privileged information and the ability to treat and heal using that information that other people maybe did not have access to. And the best known example of this, a really well-known example of it that's had a lot of influence in Western culture, was a small cult or a small, I don't know, cult sounds kind of judgmental in modern English, but a small religious group from the island of Kos in the Mediterranean Sea. People on Kos spoke Greek. It's not really, it's closer to Turkey than it is to mainland Greece, but people there spoke Greek and worshiped Greek gods, including a demigod called Asclepius. And so these people were worshippers of Asclepius, who is a god of healing, and they were sort of a religious order that practiced healing. And they became very influential in Greek and Roman times, and Hippocrates was one of them. And so later on, much later on, in the late Middle Ages and early modern times, a lot of people sort of looked at the influence that this group had had on the ancient world and tried to emulate that. And the modern practice of medicine and the sort of ethics and norms of the medical community kind of was reinvented in the image of this group from classical antiquity, the Asclepiads. So, up until fairly modern times, people used the Hippocratic Oath as sort of a guideline for medical practice, and modern medical practices are still very strongly influenced by that and by some of the other teachings and assumptions and so forth from this ancient group of people. So that was something that had a really outsized effect, partly because some of the writings were preserved and were known to people in medieval times in Europe at a time when people sort of idolized ancient Greece and Rome, and then when those countries that at that time had been, not very powerful, when they became more powerful later, they started spreading their norms and laws and so forth to the rest of the world. So that's an example of one tradition that has continued in some form into modern times. In traditional Chinese medicine, you also have a continuity from very ancient times to modern times. There are a few different schools of traditional Chinese medicine. When the current government in China took over in the 20th century, they sort of revitalized and codified some of the practices of traditional Chinese medicine. And so now when someone is getting certified in acupuncture, whether it's here in the United States or in Europe or in China, a lot of the time they're studying 5-element theory, which is sort of the preferred paradigm that the Chinese government kind of put a lot of energy into revitalizing and spreading. And there are other modalities as well that are traditional to that part of the world. So that's not the only tradition from that part of the world, but it is the one that has become really influential in modern times. So those are some examples, and the same thing, Ayurveda has followed a similar path. It was very much still widely used in India in the mid-20th century, but then the government of India, when they became an independent country, put a lot of money and a lot of resources into kind of revitalizing it and researching and publishing things about it. So that's another traditional medical system that has had a lot of content about it produced. And that's in contrast to the vast majority of herbal healing traditions out there, which have not had that kind of institutional power put behind them ever. So you have a lot of tribal healing traditions or traditional healing paths that have been passed down in families, that have been passed down through successions of teachers and students that don't have that kind of institutional backing and that kind of level of publishing and so forth about them. And the tradition that I come from is more in that category. So My people were from Ireland before they came to the United States in my grandparents and great grandparents generation. So late 1800s on one side, early 1900, or yeah, kind of early-ish 1900s on the other side. Um, and so, this was an area that was um, a colonized country at the time, and did not have a lot of didn't really have any kind of institutional power or anything like that. So the traditions that got passed down were just passed down more out of necessity than anything, and were more relevant on a local scale most of the time. So I want to go back and tell a little bit about the history of that particular tradition, that particular lineage, and how it came down to me, and how I'm what of it that I'm passing on to you. So there aren't really very good written records up until late medieval times, but we do have stories. We do have essentially fairy tales, um, but we do have stories about the origin of our family's healing tradition. And there's a story that is set at the time of the way the story is told. It kind of ties in with a larger cycle of stories called the Ruriacht that are set in the 1st century. And in this story, Eowl the Banshee, this is an ancestral goddess-like character who is a fairy that is meant to have been the ancestor of our tribe, comes to a person who is studying to be a druid, and she tells him that his father has been killed and that he has to go on a journey and sort of get revenge and things like that. So that the character from that story, who is called the Son of Mara, we look at as our sort of the originator of our specific family, and the originator of the healing tradition in our family. So it goes back to, theoretically, goes back to the Druids in pre-Christian times. And while it's impossible to say whether that's really true or not, at least culturally, the healing traditions in Ireland and in other places like it did go back to the Druids, and were passed down through hereditary families of physicians in medieval times. And our family was definitely one of those. There's definitely some good records about that. We were, at the time, if somebody was a healer, they would teach their kids to be healers. They would often marry their kids off to the kids of other healers, and keep passing things down through families. And those families would usually be attached to a powerful household who were sort of like kings of a local area, something like that. So in this case, our family was part of a larger extended family group, a tribe, or tua is the Irish word for it, called the Dalcash. And the kings of the Dalcash were the O'Brien family. And so up until about the 1300s, our family were the hereditary physicians to this family. And then there was a war, and that family lost a lot of its territory to an Anglo-Norman family called the Butlers of Ormond. And from that point on, our family was attached to that house because our lands were attached to their lordship or fiefdom or whatever it would be called. Barony, I guess is the right word for it. But so for a few hundred years, we were the traditional physicians, hereditary physicians to a very powerful, wealthy house called the Earls of Ormond, who kind of they were basically kings in all but name of Southwest Ireland. And theoretically, they were loyal to the kings of England, but in practice, they were largely autocratic and self-governing. They didn't necessarily interact with the actual royal household all that often. So that was what our family did for a couple hundred more years. And it's during that time that things really start to get written down. The printing press gets invented, things start to get published. So in the early 1600s, one of my ancestors, one of our family members, was a person named Dermot O'Mara, and he was called Dermodius de Mera in Latin and Dermot O'Mara in Irish. So everybody in the family used English and Irish and Latin. So, you know, our native language is Irish, and then English is just kind of widely used. And then Latin was something that people would write and publish in, because people all over Europe could read Latin. And so you would have people using Latin so that not only other people in their country could read it, but other people in Spain and Poland and various other Italy and various other parts of the basically the part of the world where Catholicism was prevalent. Latin was also used as a scholarly language, so that people could read it, regardless of what their at-home language was. And so Dermot O'Mara was actually the first person in our family to publish a book. And the first book he published wasn't even about herbal medicine. It was just kind of like a praise poem for his patron about kind of like a heroic story about the stuff that this guy had done, or, you know, some embellished version of the stuff that this guy had done. And in exchange for that poem, the Earl of Ormond sent him to study at Oxford. So he learned some more modern techniques. And then he went and studied at Reims, which was a university in France, and learned some about what was called spagyric medicine, which is sort of like the medical branch of alchemy. So at that point, you have various different traditions coming into things. Before this, they had studied Hippocrates and Dioscorides and other classical writers whose works were available as well. So it wasn't like it was just a purely local tradition. They incorporated all along, they incorporated elements from wherever they could get them that they felt were helpful. So he went to Reims, and then his son also went there. And his son wrote a book in the mid 1600s that I have here in front of me, that was that it was a book of cases of things that he had studied, people he had treated. So this was during the 1650s and 60s. There had been a series of political upheavals, and a lot of the tribal power structure in Ireland had been destroyed, and he and his family had fled, or well, they'd been forced out of their land and had settled in a town called Bristol in England for a while. Then he sent his children away when they were older to study in the Netherlands, and then they all came back to Ireland later on. So I wanted to show you a little bit about this book. This is so this is written in Latin. So the date on this one is 1655. And he's talking about people with pitting in their bones, even though there's no holes in the skin. You've got somebody over here with treating smallpox. um, metastatic cancer, yeah, worms, all sorts of this one's more like probably what we would nowadays call congestive heart failure. This one I've made a translation of on my Instagram page at one point, but this was a person with an ulceration on their abdomen that was penetrating their small and large intestine, which he managed to treat them with, and they later recovered and had a child. So at this point, there's a lot of detailed information about. Hang on a second. By that point in history, there's a lot of detailed information about the types of things that he was seeing, types of conditions. Not a lot published about the actual remedies that were being used. It was a question of how did they treat cancer back then. So they did use surgery to try and remove things that were operable, that were like in a place where they could be gotten to. And then they used bitter herbs to try and make the body too bitter for the cancer to continue living. So there were certain herbs, and he doesn't really specify which ones he's using, but for some of the things that might have been used at that time could have included mistletoe, ivy, an herb called lady's mantle or alchemilla. Those were all things that were used at that time to try and shrink tumors and treat cancers. And they also used heat and escharotics, which are things that will dissolve tissue if they're placed on it, are sometimes also used. So, they had a variety of different types of things, types of approaches. I don't really have any good data for how successful they were, because somebody publishes a case and it, talking about how well it worked. Well, maybe it worked well that time, but you don't necessarily know how typical those results were, or whether this was something they were able to treat frequently, or whether it was usually fatal but occasionally worked out better than that, or what. So, but they did have a lot of the same types of treatments that people would have now, in terms of having surgery and alkylating remedies and things that stimulated immune function and so forth. They had different ways of talking about them at the time. A lot of the time at this point in history, people would talk about, and we saw this some when we were looking at Culpeper's writings, which was from around the same time, but they would talk about energetics. They would talk about hotness, coldness, dryness, and things like that. Properties of that sort that are just kind of metaphorical, or kind of vague in a way. Hang on just a sec. Hold on just a minute.
So, so that's what my people were doing for herbal medicine in the 1600s. And at this point in time, you have, for one thing, you have the local remedies that grow there, which people have been using in that area, presumably for as long as there have been people in that area. You have spices that are being brought in from the spice trade from Asia. And so that would include things like nutmeg and cloves, ginger and galangal. And then recently you had, and so those had been available since the 1200s, 1300s, somewhere like that, maybe longer in some places. Certainly in the South and in Northern Africa, people had access to those herbs going back to ancient times. And then more recently, you had some herbs that were being brought over from North and South America, things like coffee and chocolate and tobacco and cayenne were all fairly new to the world of medicine at this point in time. They'd been introduced, a few generations earlier, but at first they were available in very limited quantities, and some of them took a while to catch on. I mean, I think tobacco was kind of popular instantly because it's very addictive, but mostly not for medicinal use. So after a few generations, though, medicines from North America had become somewhat popular in Europe and Asia as well. So by the 1600s, some of those things were being used right along with the things that had been available since remote antiquity and the things that had been available for a few hundred years as well. So, when you think about the history of people using medicinal plants, I think it's interesting to realize that medicinal plants were one of the first things that people wrote about when they started writing, and that when people were trading over long distances, that medicinal plants were a very common thing for them to be trading. And we talk about this in history books. When you read about it, people usually are talking about it in terms of spices, but it wasn't just spices used for medicine. It was spices used it wasn't just spices used for food. They were also used for medicine, and some of them were things that were only used as medicine. For example, frankincense. Frankincense has been popular in Western and Northern Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years, even though it grows in Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula. But it's been popular as a medicine and as a ritual incense for centuries, at least since the times of the Franks and Charlemagne and so forth, which is why in English it's called frankincense, because the English people were buying it off of the Franks, but the Franks were buying it off of the Turks. The Turks were buying it off of the Arabs. So it's it's not really Frankish. It doesn't grow in France. It grows on the Arabian Peninsula and in some other places. So that's it's important to realize that even many centuries ago that there was a fairly widespread intercontinental trade in medicinal plants. And so, like, if you read Hippocrates, he has a whole section about it, about the different herbal medicines, aromatics, and spices that the ancient Greeks, this is in 400 BC or so that he's writing this, that the ancient Greeks of his time were buying from the Arabs, and in some cases that the Arabs were getting from people in India. So, it's a very herbal medicine has been a very key part of human history. And I think that sometimes when people are writing modern history books for modern audiences, they're doing so without the understanding of what herbal medicine was or is, and that it's sometimes left out of the story. So you only hear about spices and perfumes, when really those spices and perfumes were mostly being used as medicines. And that there was not really a clear distinction between nutrition and perfumery and medicine, that they were all things that people were doing for their health. So hopefully, if you do read some history books henceforth, you'll all take that understanding with you. So yeah, Herodotus mentions cinnamon, cassia, laudanum, gum mastic, various other things that had to be brought to where he lived from another continent, over land and sea, through all sorts of dangers and stuff. And so they were very expensive by the time they got where they were going. And that's in contrast to something like dandelions that anybody could just go out and pick for free. And the herbal medicine world is still like that. There are things you can easily get for free, and then there are other things that you would have to pay for, and some of which are very expensive. And sometimes there's a lot of overlap in terms of how effective and how good the medicines are, comparing the expensive stuff to the free stuff. You don't always get more by paying more. So let's see. So I'd mentioned as far as the 1600s, and then in the late 1600s in Ireland, where my family was back to by this point, there was a really intense, really prolonged attempt at genocide, at trying to exterminate Irish people and get them to just, basically get Ireland to be the west part of Britain, as people would say at the time, and try and they made it illegal to speak Irish. They basically, any Irish families that had any real power, they tended to destroy. This is a period in history where the British Empire is gaining power, and they have cannons, and the people in Ireland did not really have cannons or artillery or anything. So the way it shook out was there was a crisis of succession. Two different people were fighting over who was going to be king of England. In Ireland, you had some people who supported one of the kings, and you had some people who were against the idea of having a king at all, and or at least against the idea of having an English king at all. And there was a big war. Actually, it wasn't that big of a war. There was a war, and then after the war, there were lots of people being driven out of their homes and moved on to a sort of reservation type system. They tried out a lot of the things that the British Empire would try later in other places, or tried out in Ireland first because it was close. So it was a time of immense devastation and loss of culture and things like that. With my particular family, they had lands of their own and a lot of wealth and things like that prior to that time. And they ended up basically hiding out in the woods for a couple of generations. They pretty much lost all the lands and all their social connections and things like that, and just sort of lived, as we might now say, off grid, out of the world of higher society and things like that for a couple generations. And in Irish, we call this period of time Aimsir Pendliha, which means the penal times. There were these set of laws called the penal laws, basically saying if you were Irish, you were only allowed to be in a certain part of the country, and if you were outside of that, you could be killed. And if you were speaking Irish, you could be killed. If you were educating Irish people towards any goal other than trade like carpentry or something like that, then you could be arrested for that. And there was a price put on the head of priests and bards and various other people who were part of the culture. So it didn't really stop people. It just kind of made them a lot more dispossessed. And it went on for a few generations, and then the laws changed and that sort of thing in the 1800s. So during the 1700s, I know who my family members were at that time, but they didn't really write anything or published anything. And they were basically back to being kind of more like the type of society that they had been a few hundred years ago, of just extended family groups relying on each other and living off of the land without a lot of trade or specialization or anything like that. But you know, without a very intact cultural or social structure. And then, well, then the 1800s happened, and give me just a minute. I need to get a drink of water, and I'll tell you some about that time period. All right. So by the early 1800s, you had a situation where Irish people were allowed to go to school as long as they professed not to be Catholic, and professed to consider the sovereign of England, the King of England, to also be the head of Christianity. And as long as you could make an oath saying that, you could go to college and things like that. So at that point, some people in my family started doing that, started going to college, and we had a couple people who studied law, and then we had somebody who was part of the family's healing tradition who studied medicine. And he studied medicine at Trinity College in Dublin, and then for a while at Oxford in England. And once he became a physician, he ended up in the army, and I'm not exactly sure. I think that he got pressed into the army, which is basically like drafted, but I'm not sure about that. He may have actually joined the army because it was you know, a possibility of upward mobility or something. But in any case, he didn't like being there, and he got he took part in a duel. He wasn't actually, he was one of the seconds in a duel. So the seconds are just kind of like referees or whatever, and each person in the duel brings their own second who's a referee, and they're there to make sure that things are, you know, that everyone is shooting each other according to the rules, basically. But the duel didn't end up taking place because dueling was not allowed. So he was with the army at that point, and he got expelled from it, and immediately got taken up by the Navy. And so he was on a succession of different ships. Um, um, Under the same captain, and the people on these ships, their ships kept
being basically, they spent most of the Napoleonic Wars waiting around while their ships were in dry dock and not actually like doing anything. But then, as luck would have it, or I'm not sure if it was luck or what all was involved in this, but he ended up being the ship's physician on a ship called the Bellerophon at the time when Napoleon surrendered on board the Bellerophon. And so the British government sent Napoleon into exile on an island called St. Helena, which is way out in the ocean and not close to anything. It was like probably like one of the most remote places of human habitation in the world, and still is. And so Napoleon asked for this person, Barry Edward O'Mara, to be his physician, to come with him into exile. And so he ended up becoming Napoleon's physician and later on Napoleon's biographer, and sort of someone who kind of took the side of Napoleon against the British in terms of writing about how Napoleon was treated as after he had surrendered, and the idea that perhaps the British people who were holding him had poisoned him. He also later wrote, after Napoleon had died, about how he made an attempt to conspire to have him rescued from the island, but it never panned out. They weren't able to. Basically, they went to Napoleon's family to try and get funding to carry off this caper, and the family didn't give them money. They said, if you can rescue him, then we'll give you money, but we're not putting up money for it to happen. So for whatever reason, they refused to do that, and so that didn't end up happening. But he was Napoleon's physician and kind of Napoleon's advocate in the court of public opinion after he eventually got sent away from St. Helena, and then Napoleon died 2 years later or so. So that was an interesting chapter in the family history. And at that point, the family, from that point on, really, various different people in the family were working against British imperialism, and really probably before that point as well, but it's harder to say. So the family has a pretty strong history of being anti-imperialist, and herbal medicine is really good for that because it's possible to practice herbal medicine without any kind of institutional backing. Whereas if you wanted to practice conventional medicine, you'd have to have access to conventional remedies, and you can't just go and make those yourself. You have to get them through, manufacturers and things like that. Whereas herbal medicine, you can do every part of the process yourself. One person or a small group of people can do all the different phases of herbal healing, including harvesting, growing, medicine making, and working with patients. It's all it's possible to have a control over the whole thing that doesn't allow you to be as easily manipulated by outside power structures. And so over the course of the last few generations, we've really tried to use that to help people have more independence, and to try and keep people from being as subject to the whims of imperialism, which I feel like is still a very big problem in our world today. We don't necessarily call it imperialism or empires anymore, but it's, large concentrations of wealth and power in the hands of relatively few people, and control of a lot of vital services like healthcare in the hands of relatively few people. So at this point, starting in the 1800s or so, there started to be more of a movement among the common people, an idea that people didn't really need to have kings anymore. America, the United States, kind of didn't have a king, and people saw that, which was a really unusual idea at the time, and people saw that and saw it working to some extent. And then other countries like France, and which France kind of originated a lot of the ideas, but their revolution was later. They kind of went back and forth with that as well. But eventually they ended up not having a king anymore. And then you had a lot of other countries striving for that as well. Although wasn't really until after World War I that you really started to get a lot of places that didn't have a king, that weren't part of an empire or anything like that. But throughout the 20th century, the dominant form of government in the world shifted away from being kingdoms and empires to being more like republics and things like that. So early on in that time period, we were definitely involved in some organizations within Ireland that were advocating for that sort of change. And so we had a lot of the herbal medicine has been instrumental in helping that to happen, helping people to have healthcare systems and healthcare that was available to people, that was not controlled by a singular government entity. And to some extent that's shifted a little bit the other way within the last couple generations of having, more of a corporate structure rather than a governmental one, but having, having a few large companies that make most of the medicines, and then have an outsized effect on how healthcare is carried out in the world. But I still believe in the ability of herbal medicine to empower people and societies to take care of their own health. And so that's part of the anti-imperialist tradition that I come from, and it's part of what I try to pass on to people, is that people can be more directly empowered to take care of their own health and take care of the health of their communities using plant medicine. So that struggle for independence and for not having a king anymore and for not being part of an empire anymore is a big part of what drove both sides of my family, both my mother's side and my father's side, to move over to this country. So on my father's side, which is the O'Mara side of the family, which I've been talking about, there are written records going back many generations of who was who and what they were doing in each different generation and each different century. And on my mom's side, we didn't really have that. It was more like I knew my grandmother and she knew her mom, but there weren't really a lot of records going far back. I know what part of Ireland they were from, and I know that when they were there, they traveled around selling herbal remedies to people, and that after Ireland was divided into Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, they came over here to the United States because the route that they had traveled was now split up among two different countries. And so they came over here to the United States and became healthcare providers over here. They were doing more like, I guess, what nowadays we would call skilled nursing, something like that. But basically just caring for the sick, especially people with tuberculosis, which was a more common problem back then. So, and my great grandmother was killed in a car accident when someone hit her when she was walking home from taking care of a sick person on Christmas. So, you know, it was and is a job where people make a lot of sacrifices, put themselves at risk, things like that, to take care of people who are ill. But it's always has always been and will always be an important part of being a person, of being a human society, is that we have the ability to take care of each other. Um, we have the ability to make remedies and bring them to each other, and you know, sit with each other, feed each other, things like that, which, you know, wouldn't be that easy to do. It's not something that other animals are necessarily as capable of. Uh, So, you know, if a deer out in the woods breaks its leg, the other deers really can't do that much to help it. They can't, like, really, you know, make tools for it like crutches, or even very easily go and get medicine for it and bring it back or anything like that. They're not set up for that sort of thing so much, even if they are in some cases familiar with the healing properties of some of the plants. So I really think of herbal medicine as being, you know, mostly a privilege of being human, being something that we can do for each other and that we should do for each other, and that's something that helps to make healthier people and stronger communities. And so that comes a lot from this history that I've been talking about. Um, and so that's kind of my lineage and my ethos of how I practice. It's more about well, it's mainly about people taking care of each other, and that people taking care of each other is a really vital thing. So that's my tradition. If you look around the herbal world in this country today, you have a lot of different types of herbal traditions. And I was just recently at a conference in Colorado, the American Herbalist Guild Symposium, and this year's theme was all about herbal legacies. And so you have people coming from a few different, a lot of the herbalists in this country right now come from a few different lineages, I guess is the best word for it. For instance, there was an herbalist named Michael Moore who was in the Southwest, practicing from the 70s until I think he died in the early 2000s, maybe the late 90s. But he was his students and his students make up a lot of the herbalists who are out there today. And then there was another one named John Christopher. John Christopher was an herbalist in Utah back in the 40s. And people who are descended, not like biologically descended from him, but his students and their students and so on, are also another huge chunk of the herbalists in this country. For instance, Michael Tierra was one of his students, and then Michael Tierra has had thousands of other students over the course of you know, being one of the main herbal teachers, or one of the most prolific herbal teachers from, I guess, the 1980s up until I think he retired from teaching last year, essentially. Maybe not completely, but he turned over the management of his school to someone else, to one of his students last year. So, you know, for many decades. Rosemary Gladstar is another example. She's been teaching herbal medicine for decades now, and has a lot of students and students of students and so forth that are out there practicing. Besides that small group of people, there are a lot of other cultural traditions out there, because a lot of people just come from areas of the world where herbal medicine is what people are used to using. And I think it's, noteworthy that right now, somewhere around 3/4 of the people in the world use herbal medicine as their primary form of healthcare. So, sometimes people will talk about herbal medicine as being alternative medicine, but it's not alternative at all. It's the mainstream of human healthcare on earth. Uh, and, conventional medicine is a very distant second when it comes to that. So it's definitely a widespread thing. And so you have a lot of people who maybe grew up in some particular cultural tradition, like here in Kentucky, a lot of people grew up with herbal medicines because in Appalachia, it's still very widely used. And you also have, the same types of things in various different places and in various different immigrant communities and in various different regions of the U.S. as well. Um, so, for example, the Gullah Coast in South Carolina and that area, there are a lot of herbalists from that part of the country whose herbal traditions come ultimately from Africa by way of the American Southeast and by way of the groups of people that were enslaved there and, sometimes brought medicines over with them, sometimes found similar medicines here, or incorporated medicines that the native people were using here um, when they came over. And then, of course, you have a lot of different uh, indigenous tribes throughout North America that are using their medicinal traditions. And then in Latin America, you have a combination of indigenous and European herbal remedies and traditions that are also that have been, that people have uh, kind of combined and taken with them wherever they've gone and that sort of thing. So you have a lot of different cultural traditions of herbal medicine here as well, some of which might not have a very clearly articulated line of teachers or anything like that. Sometimes you have people who are specialized in it, and sometimes you have people who just happen to know a lot about it because they do a lot of caretaking, and it's part of how caretaking is done. So a lot of both of those things, a lot of each of those things around. And I really encourage people to learn not just from one specific tradition, but from a variety of sources, because there are lots of other people out there who know fascinating stuff that you don't. And so for me, while I have a particular tradition or a particular lineage that I'm coming from, part of the history of that lineage is that we've always tried to learn from other people. We've always tried to incorporate new information whenever we found it, because there's just more to know than any one person can ever know. And so I very much encourage um, anyone who wants to know a lot about herbal medicine to try and know a lot about it from a lot of different sources. In ancient times, in our family, back in the times of the hereditary physician families, people would sometimes send their kids to be raised by a different family for a few years, and maybe like swap their teenagers for somebody else's teenagers for a few years, and that way people learned things from other families and kept their knowledge maybe fresher or at least more varied. And while that's not really something that we do anymore, I do think that learning through other traditions is an important part of learning. So in my lifetime, and I've where I grew up, I learned a lot from people in Eastern Kentucky who were herbalists who were coming from that particular tradition. And then I also did a year of studying molecular biology at Western Kentucky University, and learned a lot of stuff that was not directly about plant medicine, but it was about plants and about the substances in them. And I incorporate a lot of that into what I know now and into what I do in clinical practice. I also learned how to use microscopes, at least more in depth than I previously had known. And so that's something that I bring to bear in my practice now. So, I really encourage people to learn from a variety of sources. Um, and we're fortunate enough to live in a time when there are lots of access to lots of variety of sources out there, everything from YouTube videos and webinars from other herbalists to books to, various different schools and things like that, which, I would be happy for any of you to continue studying with me for years and years if you want to. Think about year 2 starting in May if you are interested in that. But at the same time, I also think it's a good idea to learn from other sources as well. Hang on just a minute and I will be right back. So, I guess that's about what I have to say about the lore and lineage. Hopefully you find that at least somewhat useful. And so I want to talk about a couple of herbs today, as usual. And the one I want to talk about first is called Devil's Walking Stick, or Aurelia spinosa. This is a small tree. It's in the same family as ivy and ginseng, and it's in the same genus Aurelia as a few other medicinal plants that grow, two other medicinal plants that grow here in Kentucky, both of which are sometimes called spikenard, which is not, which is a name that it's a name that originally belongs to a different plant. But these plants, Aurelia spinosa, is it's a little tree. Usually the trunk is not more than 1.5 inches across. Often it's quite a bit smaller than that. Broom handle size or smaller, and it has thorns, and that's why it's called Devil's Walking Stick, because it's prickly. And in particular, it has thorns in rings. Like it'll have a ring of thorns all the way around it, which is a pretty distinctive appearance compared to the couple of other trees with thorns that grow around here. They don't have thorns that grow in rings. So you'll have kind of a raised ridge with thorns on it sticking out all the way around the small trunk or branch of the tree. It has pinkish flowers that grow in big clusters, and then it has tiny, dark colored berries when they ripen, and very large compound leaves. The part that's used medicinally is the bark, and the bark is, I would consider it an adaptogen and as being supportive to the endocrine system. A lot of the time, it is one of the main things I'll use to try and balance out the endocrine system or strengthen function of the endocrine system and the hormones. If things are just off, not in a very specific way, but just maybe if somebody's energy isn't good, if their blood sugar isn't stable, sometimes if stress or if hormonal changes are hitting them really hard, sometimes it's really helpful for that. So it doesn't have any one big thing that it does. It's what's called a tonic or an alterative. It just makes a bunch of slight differences that can add up to a substantial change in how someone feels for most things. I do find it to be helpful in people who have high blood sugar. Not in all of them, but fairly often it is something that helps with high blood sugar. Possibly by decreasing the rate that the body releases sugar into the bloodstream, although I'm not completely sure about that. Its pharmacology has not been really well elucidated, like as far as what the different substances in it do. We do know that it contains some steroidal compounds that are steroidal glycosides is what they're called. They're sort of a steroid molecule with a sugar molecule attached, and they are anti-inflammatory, and they have modulatory effects on the endocrine system and on how the body responds to stress and inflammation. So usually, if I am trying to help balance someone's endocrine system, help their hormones to function better, without pushing things hard in one direction or another, without giving anything that's a lot like going to have an estrogenic effect or a testosterone type effect or anything, using Devil's Walking Stick can be really helpful. If somebody has blood sugar that tends to get high or that tends to be high when they wake up, especially, I use it for that, and it seems to be pretty helpful for that. Someone has um, gained weight, especially after having hormonal change, like maybe having a baby or something like that, and or going through menopause, and they're not having much success with losing it. Sometimes devil's walking stick helps with that too, probably by helping to regulate the blood sugar in some way or another. It does tend to make people feel a little more energetic, and it does tend to make people feel a little less achy and inflamed and things like that. So it's something that has a variety of different uses. And the usual way I prepare this is just by making a tincture out of the bark. The bark itself is pretty thin because it is a small tree. It doesn't have very thick bark at all. It has, when you peel the bark off, it's basically like two paper thin layers, a green layer and a brown layer. And then the wood or the stem inside of that is sort of hollow, but like a thin layer of wood and then a layer of pith in the middle. So it's a small and rather insubstantial tree. And usually, if you want to harvest the bark, you want to do that in the springtime while the leaves are growing, before the flowers have started to bloom. And you can cut a few stalks of it, and it will grow back from the root ball. So it's very weedy. It's not hard to harvest sustainably, because you can just cut down, you might have like a root that has a few different stems on it, and you can cut down a stem here and there from a stand. It will often grow in stands in disturbed ground, such as alongside roads, or if you have like a dirt pile where somebody has done some bulldozing or something like that, it loves to grow in those. It takes a few years to grow, but it loves to grow in disturbed ground like that. And it's because it has berries, it's distributed, the seeds are distributed by birds. And so it's something you'll often find. I don't really see it in Fayette County, which is probably an air quality issue. But once you get out into the surrounding counties, like even Clark County or Scott County or something like that, where it's more farmland and less city, then you start to see it. And it's, I don't know exactly why that is. I said it could be an air quality issue. It could also be like what kind of birds live there that eat the seeds and stuff like that. So for whatever reason, you find it more in disturbed ground out in the country rather than in town. And not in old growth forests or anything, unless it's at the edge of them or along a road that cuts through them or something like that. It's very shade tolerant, but kind of needs that loose dirt to get started in. So it often is, it's often out in the country, but somewhere close to the haunts of humans, where they've done something to the ground. And so it's yeah, kind of a weedy species, something that you can easily gather pretty sustainably. If you take a couple, sometimes you'll get like a trunk of it that's maybe, like I said, an inch and a half across and 8 feet long or something like that. And if you get a few of those, you can make a pretty decent sized dose of decent sized store of tincture. And so it's something that it's not hard to gather a year's worth of in an afternoon. As far as toxicity goes, I haven't really seen any from it. I usually only use it in doses of up to a teaspoon or so. But it appears to be very safe and well tolerated. So it has the word devil in the name, which makes it seem a little bit scary, but I think that's just because it's prickly and it doesn't have any meaningful amount of toxicity to it that anyone knows of. like anything else, there probably is a dose that you could take that would be bad for you, but it's not a dose that anyone would normally take in the course of using it as a medicinal herb. All right. Any questions about that particular herb before I move on? All right. So the other herb that I want to talk about is prickly pear cactus. Prickly pear is our only native cactus here, and I think that we did see this on one of our herb walks. It does grow wild here in Kentucky. It will often grow along fence lines. Prickly pear is so named because of the fruit, which is a sort of cylindrical, it's a fruit with prickles on it, like little clusters of prickly hairs called glochids, which are the same types of things that are on the pad of the prickly pear. But the fruit is, inside the fruit is very sweet, and it has a lot of seeds. It's a little bit, let's see, what would I say about the size of it? Anywhere between the size of like a jalapeno pepper up to about a quarter the size of a banana or something like that. Kind of cylindrical, made out of the same stuff as the rest of the cactus, but as it ripens, it turns deep scarlet color and contains a lot of seeds. So fruit-eating animals like possums and raccoons will eat it sometimes. The outside of it is covered in these prickly hairs, so they often leave it there until they get really hungry. But then they do go along distributing the seeds. So often you'll find the seeds along, often you'll find it growing along fence rows, along the sides of buildings, places like that where a creature that might be like a raccoon or a possum might be creeping along in the dark, avoiding being seen. So it's a desert plant, so it's very tolerant of dryness, but unlike a lot of other cactuses, it can withstand freezing temperatures and it can withstand heavy rain. So it likes being in strong sunlight, but it will struggle along without it. The fruits, like I said, are sometimes left on the plant for a long period of time. So you could find fruits on it now, and you could even find fruits on it sometimes into the end of winter, unless the animals get really hungry, because the outer skin is kind of challenging to eat around without getting the prickles in your mouth. For those of us who have things like hands and utensils and stuff like that, it's not that challenging. You can also often find it in the grocery store. Sometimes it's sold under the name tuna, which is unfortunately also the name of a type of fish, but no relation. Sometimes it's just called prickly pear fruit, but you'll more frequently find the pads of prickly pears. So the pads are the part that's used medicinally, and they're the more common part that's used as a vegetable as well. And it's called nopal or nopalitos when it's prepared as food. And these are they're the pads. People sometimes think of them as the leaves, but they're actually stem. They're actually like a thick, flat piece of stem. And so before preparing it as medicine or food, it's a good idea to take a knife and scrape the prickly bits off of it so that those don't end up in anybody's mouth. When it's made as food, it can just be cut up into small pieces and eaten. When it's made into medicine, you can make a tincture out of it or a decoction out of it, and it will thicken the tincture or decoction and make it very slippery and stringy. And the medicinal property that you get from this is that the stuff that makes it slippery and stringy is a type of soluble fiber. It's like a starch that soaks up water and turns it into a gel. And if you eat this before or take the medicine before you eat a meal, it decreases the rate at which sugar from that meal is distributed into your system. It sort of slows the absorption of sugar, which means that people don't get the same spike in their blood sugar that they would get otherwise, called a postprandial glucose spike. Postprandial meaning after a meal. And this is often one of the more difficult aspects of blood sugar for people to control. So prickly pear can be used along with other things to help regulate blood sugar and keep blood sugar from becoming too high or changing too quickly. And so it's a really useful. I would never use it by itself to try and manage blood sugar, but it can be a useful addition to a set of actions and remedies and so forth for helping to manage blood sugar, and particularly for helping to manage that change in blood sugar that happens as someone eats a meal. So just kind of creates sort of a net that catches the sugar molecules and slowly releases them so that they're not all hitting the bloodstream at once. And that can make a big difference in how someone feels and in how much strain is getting put on their kidneys by their blood sugar and things like that. So I use that all the time for people who need some help in managing their blood sugar. So yeah, when I'm using it as food, I just recommend that people eat, a serving of it as often as they can. When using it as a medicine, I usually would have people take a tablespoon of the liquid extract, which is a pretty large amount, but it kind of, because its action is really more physical than chemical, it's not getting into the bloodstream and changing how your body is using sugar. It's changing the rate at which sugar is being transferred from your digestive system into your bloodstream. And so that's, something that requires that there be a physically large quantity of it. So a tablespoon is usually the dose I would start with of that. I often will use it along with things like cinnamon or devil's walking stick that might have other effects on blood sugar. All right, any question about either of those herbs today? All right, and any questions about any of the concepts I've brought up as far as lineage and that sort of thing goes? Okay, well, as of right now, we are halfway through the course. So we've done 6 months of the 1-year course. So congratulations to everybody who's made it to this point. I know that it's been a lot of time and attention and so forth, and I really appreciate that. And so I look forward to the next 6 months with you as well. Also, I'm enrolling now for next year's classes. So if you're interested in doing an advanced class, a year 2 class, let me know. And if you know of anybody who would be interested in taking the year 1 class that you're taking now, starting next May, let them know that it is available, and I would really appreciate that. And once again, if any of you have any plant collections you'd like me to look at, or if any of you would like to meet with me to talk about them, or feel like you might need some assistance with them, please reach out to me about that. All right. Well, Any questions about anything else before we go? Okay, so next week, I will be doing this on Wednesday instead of Tuesday. So on Halloween, we will postpone it for the day, and we will do that Wednesday instead of the Tuesday. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to talking to you again next week. Bye.